So, welcome to our webinar, the Practicalities of Moving to France, part of our Retire Abroad virtual roadshow webinar series. Today we're aiming to give you an idea of some of the issues you should consider as you plan your retirement to France. And then this is followed by a webinar covering the issues around property in France. And then this afternoon we'll look at the financial issues to consider. So we're looking particularly here at the immigration issues, the healthcare and other sort of practicalities, as I say, of moving in. I'm Nigel Ayres. I run the Expat Network. I've lived in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and the US, and I've for the last 3.5 years in Spain. We're joined today by Tracy Leonetti of LBS France, and she will be introducing herself in a moment. So before we start, just please remember that we're here to answer your questions. So if you have any, please use the button on your screen and put any questions to us. We'll answer all that we can during the course of the webinar. Any that we don't cover during the webinar, we will deal with after the event. Now, I've said that on all of the webinars so far, but I've now discovered that I don't actually necessarily have your email if you have not used your real name. So if you do have any questions that don't get answered, or you want to send anything afterwards, then please contact us at expats@expatnetwork.com. Okay, and so let's get started. Perhaps we can start with Tracy giving us a little introduction about yourself and your business and the services you provide.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Nigel, and hi to everybody joining today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So, as Nigel said, my name is Tracy Leonetti, LBS, and I have been in France for 30 years, living, working, business in France for over 10 years. I came to France 30 years ago, effectively now, with a small child and no visas, and struggled through a lot of the paperwork through a couple of years. And I realized at that stage it shouldn't be so complicated. So that was the main reason behind I set up LBS. The idea being to help people like yourselves who are thinking of moving to France, to help them plan and to relocate to France, to help them with a smooth transition from a paperwork perspective. So the role of myself and the team at LBS is to help clients from A to Z with their relocation, be that property, be that obviously a main concern, visas and immigration, healthcare, car registration, driving license, and schooling and business creations, and all those wonderful paperwork problems that you may encounter when you're thinking of moving, living, or have a business in France. So our job is to make your life smoother.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. So I think first of all, if we just sort of look at some of the issues that people need to consider as they plan their retirement, and the first one is how you're going to pay for it. Obviously for most people, that will be a matter of taking the money from private and state pensions, investments, and so on. We'll be dealing with the private pensions this afternoon, but I will just give you a little background on the state pension, because that's quite often an issue, and I have recent personal experience which I can share. Essentially, if you are already receiving a state pension, you can continue to have it paid into your bank in the UK and then just simply transfer the money, or you can arrange for it to be paid into a bank account in France. If you are going to reach retirement age, as I did, having moved abroad, then you have to deal with the International Pensions Department. Now, the International Pensions Department have a lovely form, and you download that. When you download it, you have to fill in all sorts of details. The first question they ask is, have you ever lived in the UK? Which for most of you, of course, seems like an odd question. And then they ask you for all of the places you lived, all of the employers you've ever had, an enormous number of detailed questions. And personally, I gave up very quickly. So the thing to do is to pick up the phone. There's a phone number. It's on our website if you look in the retirement section. And basically, they then just ask you a few questions. You need your national insurance number and various bits and pieces. Go through that, and then you're into the system, and that should all work. In my case, it didn't work. 3 months later, I hadn't heard anything, and I rang again, and they said, sorry, nothing seems to have happened to your application. I'll put you on the urgent list, and 1 week later, it was all sorted out. So the phone is the key with the state pension. I don't know whether there's anything you want to add there, Tracy, but that's basically my experience of the state pension.
Yeah, I think it's all about the follow-up, isn't it? And it's the same. The same can be said for any process you're going through. It's all about the follow-up. If you haven't received any information between 3 to 4 weeks, then it's time to follow up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So the other side of sort of being able to afford your retirement is what sort of costs are you going to be facing? Now, France is obviously a very large country, and things will vary enormously across that country. But could you give us a flavour of how the cost of living compares in France compared to the UK?
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously it's a question that's important, the one that you have to weigh up when you're thinking of moving to France. And on a general basis, the cost of living has gone up for everybody across Europe and across the world, effectively. So that's you will also feel when you come to France. I think you will find, in a general basis, that France has a lower cost of living than the UK currently, that is for sure. And certainly the numbers are showing that. If you look at the economic numbers, are about 20% down in France compared to the UK. Of course, then you have to think about the cost of living from a geographical perspective, because of course, like in any country, where you're living can affect the cost of living. So when you're thinking about where you want to live, if cost of living and price factor is an issue to you, think about whereabouts in France could be the most appropriate. Now, of course, if you're thinking of the north of France, the northwestern part of France, you would get a good value for money on property, and the cost of living is probably slightly lower due to the north-south kind of divide thing. And if you go down towards the PACA and the Côte d'Azur area, of course, the cost of living is quite high because you pay for the sunshine, quite frankly. But I think you will find that day to day, you will find that the cost of living in France is lower than in the UK, and you can find some very good, it's like in any country, once you live in it, you can go to restaurants that can cost you a lot of money, but you can find some local little bistros in your village or town where it's very, very good pricing. So it's really about choosing the area in France which meets your budget. And then, of course, once you are settled in your town or village, then look into those bars and restaurants that are actually local ones, and maybe not the tourist traps where, of course, you will pay more money.
Yes, I think one of the points sort of often Sue made is that one of the things to remember is that you can go onto a site like numbeo.com, which has price comparisons by country, by city, but you need to make sure that what you're doing is not comparing the costs for your lifestyle in the UK, but the life that you will be living in France, because the lifestyle will be different. So, for instance, if you're living in the warmer south or whatever, you're likely to be outdoor much more than you are in the UK. You're likely to be in restaurants much more, and so on. And so, those sort of comparisons are not always directly there. And also, one of the things you can normally find, I'm sure you can in France, is shops that will sell you English products, specialist sort of things for the expats. Yeah. Now that's fine, but they tend to cost a lot more. So, you're going to be paying a lot more than you normally do for your PG tips or whatever. And it's always worth remembering, with the exception of tea, that there's always a good French equivalent. I think with tea, normally, from my experience with my wife, she sticks religiously to her UK brand.
Well, actually, now you'll find in most supermarkets now you have the Tetley brand in there, which is a really good, and you even sometimes see in some of the local shops, the bigger supermarkets, Yorkshire tea, would you believe I've come across. So if you look around now, there are more and more UK brands, even in the tea bag section, because thank goodness, that, living on the French Lipton things. Oh my goodness, it's dreadful.
Indeed, indeed. Not only, I guess, there's similar stuff in Spain where I've been. So then, sort of perhaps moving on to property. One of the issues is, whether to rent or buy, and then the UK property. Again, we're going to be dealing with this in what to do with your UK property. So we'll be dealing with this in more detail in the next session. But perhaps if we just very quickly cover rent or buy. I mean, what would you see as the pros and cons between renting and buying?
There are good, like you say, pros and cons for both. And when I do a consultation with my clients before they come into France, we do discuss with some people, depending on what visa you're coming across with, that can change your choice. Rental markets, depending where you move into in France, is very difficult at the moment. There is not a huge amount of availability for rentals, especially if you go into the tourist areas, because of course in the tourist areas you'll find a lot of the rental accommodation are rented out between July and September for the tourist season, because they get a lot more money. So if you're looking for a long-term let of 1 year, for example, for a long stay visitor's visa, you may have difficulty with that. But it is a very good solution for people who are not quite sure where they want to live yet, and not quite sure of where, what property they want to have. So a long-term rental or a 6-month renewable rental is fantastic. So you can come into France with your visa and look around whilst you're waiting to buy. Just be careful of not leaving that process for looking for the rental too late because of the fluctuation on the market. Of course, people often ask me, is it a risk to buy the property first before having access to visas? It's not, because you can buy a property without being a resident of France, of course. So that is a possibility. Come across on your 9180, look for your property to buy your property, then work on the visa process, or in parallel once you've signed your compromis de vente. So it is really a personal choice. I would say some people feel more committed to the process, want to buy up front, or absolutely know where they want to buy and what they want to buy, therefore they go straight for the buying process. Other people want to take it a little bit slowly, therefore the rental process is much better. It is an option. You can use it for your visa process. Just be very aware of the fluctuation on the market from area to area.
Okay, yes, and I think that renting can give you the opportunity to really get to know the area you're moving if you don't know it fully, and therefore it's all very well to know the area you want, but what about the precise part of that village or town or whatever?
Yeah, France is a big place. You might know you want to live in I don't know, you might know you want to live in the Lot-et-Garonne, or you might know you want to live in the Bordeaux area, but which village, what part? There is a huge choice. And sometimes renting is a way of reassuring yourself that you're choosing the right place, because buying is a commitment,
Yeah.
And you want to be sure of it.
Okay, thank you. On the UK property, the comment I make there is that everybody has their own position. So for some cases, you need to sell the property to finance your purchase in France. In other cases, you can hold on to it and remortgage it to finance that. In other cases, you want it as a sort of opportunity to retreat back to the UK if for any reason there's family reasons, personal reasons, or just simply you don't settle into France and you're worried that might happen. So there are a number of things, but one of the things to bear in mind is that one of the common things that people do is hold on to their property, and then sort of a year or so down the line they decide to sell it. Now the only problem with that is that you've got your personal private abode exemption in the UK, but once you've left the country and gone abroad, then you don't have that anymore, and the gain will become taxable potentially in France. But again, we'll go into that in a little more detail during the financial session this afternoon. I don't know whether you would add anything on the UK property.
I think it is a question that comes a lot in the consultations, and obviously the capital gains tax you need to think about if you sell your property once you become a resident of France. Absolutely something to think about. But a lot of people as well, what they like to do is, especially people who are coming across as early retirees or with long stay non-work visas, like to use the property in the UK for rental income, because that becomes as part of their revenue to meet the revenue criteria. So it could be an option for people who don't have any necessarily huge investment income or don't have a lot of savings left over to use the property eventually down the road for rental income for their tax declarations.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. So I guess when people are moving abroad, for many, despite many foreign holidays, this will be, a slightly intimidating opportunity, and people can be nervous about how easy it is to settle in. Could you give them some tips on how it is and reassure them that settling in abroad into France, into a new lifestyle, is not a problem?
It's interesting because, by the time people reach out to us, 9 times out of 10, they've kind of decided they want to move to France. When I moved across 30 years ago, literally I spoke no French. I was not organised with my paperwork, and I'd even had nowhere to live. I had travelled extensively. Australia, New Zealand, I lived in Bermuda, I've been, to America. And because it was so difficult to get to those countries, I figured it'd be so easy just to go across the water to France. Mistake. But what I will say is not a mistake is the settling process is what you make it. You need to give yourself a year to adjust to a new culture, a culture that I'm sure you are looking forward to discovering. That's why you're thinking of France. It's really important that you settle into the local area. So, maybe reach out to local associations, to local meetups. Try and avoid the expat community from the only source of mingling, because if you want to learn the French language, then reaching out to the French community is the best way to go. Make sure that you don't think you're going to learn French by sat behind your PC on some sort of application on your phone. The best way to learn French is to get out there and practice it with your local shopkeepers, going to buy your bread every morning, having a coffee in your local coffee shop, by chatting with old people at the bus station. There are amazing ways to learn French, and it's not necessarily just by looking at a book. And I think it's really important when going through that settling process that you give yourself the time and opportunity to meet the people. For example, your neighbours, you can bring them across for a little drink or an apéro, because that's very, very popular in France. National Neighbours Day, which falls in May, I think, every year. So that's a great opportunity to meet your neighbours. Join in with the local activities in the community. There's always events going, especially in the summer. And if you have small children, my advice would be to join them in local activities. They have very good children's clubs in France for all ages. It's amazing what they do, and they cost next to nothing. So put your children in local activities with the French people, and they'll mingle straight away. Hope that helps. Give me a few tips.
Yes, indeed. And I think, obviously for people with children, that the school gate and so on is always a very good and easy way to settle in, as I've found over the years in different countries people have done. But for those people who are sort of approaching retirement, that option may not be there. So generally speaking, it is about your personal interest. If you play golf, join the golf club. If you play tennis, do it. And certainly, I don't know that paddle has reached France as much as it has Spain, but that is an increasingly popular thing, which is a combination of tennis and squash, and effectively is played by people I know locally in Spain, where we've been. People into their 70s and so on are regularly playing, and then of course there's lawn bowls and other such things that people can do. So your interest, or if you're a churchgoer and so on, that's another obvious sort of route to people. So it's really about using those interests to find out locally how to get on with those and blend in. But as Tracy has said, these things can take time. In my own case, it took a little longer because COVID arrived a few months after we'd arrived. So not being able to go out of your front door was a slight issue. So then in terms of relocating, getting ready to go, obviously you can decide what you take with you. And I think that overall, there's some major decisions there as to whether you take your whole sort of household over to France, and or whether you sort of buy when you get there. And that's really a matter of working out yourself. But when it comes to moving, the one thing I'd just like to emphasize, man in a van can be, a perfectly good way of doing things, and I've done it myself several times. The issue that I have come across is that you have to remember the weight as well as the capacity, because we worked out that we could get it all in a van, but when they arrived they said, sorry, we can't do that because it's too heavy, the totality of it, and so you actually needed 2 vans rather than 1 van because of the weight. Whereas if you're using a removal company, of course they've got much less restriction on weight because they're big solid trucks and so on. So Tracy, any sort of comments about that sort of decision of what you take and how you take it and so on?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the clients we work with, and when we get them before they move across, of course, the relocation, I think the first thing, and I mean, it's probably common sense, but maybe not, decluttering. So, I think it's really important. It's like when you move in a house within your own country, it's already extremely stressful and takes a lot of your time. But when you're moving countries, and especially moving outside into a European country from a non-European, there are a lot of other parameters to take into account. So the first thing, of course, I would suggest is start now. Even if your project is for a year from now, it doesn't take time to start thinking about what you would eventually take with you on an Excel spreadsheet. So very basic Excel spreadsheet, start putting in there what you will take with you, so that you can start to evaluate the size and the quantity and the estimate of cost. Start throwing out, getting rid of, selling anything you don't need, because you really don't want to pay things to coming across that you can buy just as well here. So start decluttering. And of course, if you're working with a transporter, which is the best way to do it coming across, they will help you through the customs duties to avoid paying anything. And especially if you're bringing cars across, make sure your cars are on the inventory list, because you will need to register the car in France.
Yeah, and pets is another thing. When people are bringing pets, is that a complicated process into France?
Well, it's not that complicated, really. I mean, it's paperwork at its best, like anything, So I think the most important thing on the pets front to mention, of course, because of this non-EU situation for the UK since Brexit, there's no such thing as the pet passport. It won't work. So it's important that you reach out to your local veterinarian before you come to France, and they'll have to fill in a health document for your animal, which they have to sign and stamp, and it comes across with you. And then I think once you are in France, the best way to do, and this is a lot for people as well who are not even residents, is to get a pet passport in France, register with a local veterinarian in France, and they can get you a pet passport in France, which will then help you when you're coming backwards and forwards with your animal. But the process itself is not difficult. Obviously, the coming across with your car, with your animals, the usual process, but it's more about just getting that health certificate from your vet before you come. Plan at least 3 to 4 weeks before you're coming across to sort your paper out for your animal.
Right. Okay, thank you. So let's now move on to the sort of main formality of immigration and visas. I'll start off just by explaining, for those, most people are familiar now, but now that we're not members of the EU, if you want to go to France, you need to have a visa if you're planning to stay long term. For those of you who are only going short term and are going to be spending part of the year, then you're subject to the Schengen visa rules. Under the withdrawal agreement, you don't, as Brits, do not have to apply for a visa, but you're subject to the rules of the Schengen zone. And what that means is that you can spend 90 in every 180 days. And this can sound a little confusing, but the easiest way to think of it is look at today, look back 180 days, and you must not have spent more than 90 of those days in the EU or in the Schengen zone as a whole. What that means is that you can go for 3 days and then 5 days. You can do the whole 90 in one go. It doesn't matter how it comes, but within that 180 days, then you can't do more than 90. The other thing to bear in mind is that that restriction applies across the Schengen zone, which includes the EU, most of the EU, and one or two other countries, Switzerland and various others. And you can if you Google Schengen zone, you'll find out exactly which countries those are. But even if you get residence in France, you're still subject to the Schengen zone rules for the rest of it. So if you go out of France into Spain, say, you're still restricted to that 1,980 days in Spain. Now, the reality of life is that if you drive over the border, there's nobody knows you've done it. And so they have no real way of checking that you have done it. You have stuck to the Schengen zone. But those are the rules. The other thing to bear in mind is that if you do in the short term go break the rules for the Schengen and you get found out, then that can cause you major difficulties in most countries in terms of your visa when you do apply for it. So it's well worth making sure that you stick within the rules. There are generally people who comply and people who don't comply, and I have some friends who have not complied and have generally got away with it. But if you don't, but we also have various of the people we work with who have had clients who haven't complied and have got found out, and have then been denied a visa as a result. So their whole idea of moving has been destroyed. So that's the sort of thing on the short stay. But then if you want to stay, planning to retire permanently into France or full time into France, then you need to get a visa. So, Tracy, could you sort of outline this? Oh, actually, before we go there, what's your experience in terms of enforcement of the 90 and 180 days? Is that?
Yeah, so, Brexit happened and the first year was a little bit messy and nothing really, stamping passports, not stamping passports. There was a bit of a mess going on there. And it still is a little bit, there are times when you've got a visa and still stamp your passport. So the border control coming into the Schengen area from the UK can be messy. Once you're in the Schengen area, as you rightly say, Nigel, there are no border controls, so it's very difficult to enforce the 9180. However, I would highly advise people to respect it, because it does jeopardize your rights to visa, because it's an offence to stay longer in a country than the rules. So if they find you that you have overstayed your welcome due to the stamping in, stamping out, then it can jeopardize your visa. And also to remind you that coming in 2023, although it keeps getting pushed out, the new EES system, the entry and exit system that they're going to bring in, which will then control the movement within the Schengen area. I don't know when that is coming in. It was supposed to be coming in 2023. That will have a bigger impact.
I think the dates have been gone to the latest I heard was November, but I don't know. That's correct.
It was November. It was supposed to be 2022, got pushed to 2023, but I've got a feeling it might get pushed out again, because I don't think everybody's ready for it from a border control perspective. It would cause too many delays. But I think it's despite the fact that, they are aware this is a problem, so it means they're looking at it. So if you're thinking of having a long stay visa in the future, respect the 9180 in the meantime.
Okay, thank you. So then moving on to the long-term visa, could you just outline what the options are if you're planning to retire to France?
Sure. So we have two scenarios, when I have consultations with my clients about moving to France and what the options are. Really, for retirees, if you want to move to France, but not respect the 9180, say you want to spend 4 or 5 months in France, but not become a resident of France, then you can apply for a 6-month visa. That is something you can do if you don't want to have this worry of 9180. You might want to spend 4 months, in your secondary home in France. Just apply for a 6-month visa. That's the easy one. If you are thinking that you are looking to retire to France definitively, but not work, so retire, not work, Then a long stay visitors visa would be the way to go. I do have some small podcasts on this on my website, so you can listen to literally 4 or 5 minutes. You might get some good info and tips for that. The long stay visitors visa, which is the most popular one for retirees, is it's a year visa and allows you to come into France. And once you're in France and have gone through the process, you would then renew it from France. So once you're in France, you would renew it each year as a non-working retiree. Therefore, it's just the first part of the process which takes place from country of origin. Once you have your visa, the renewal takes place 2 months before it expires. And then when it renews, you get the actual card. But in the first instance, it stays in your passport. And it's probably the easiest visa to get for those people who are financially independent and have somewhere to stay. That is the one I would go for.
Right. And what are the sort of requirements for that? What do you have to show to get it?
So I would suggest that in the long stay visitors visa, there are 4 key areas that you need to prove from a criteria. Basically, the first one is who you are, obviously. So your ID papers are very important. And for married ladies who have changed the name, then marriage certificate would be important. Or if you change your name by default, showing that. So the ID of who you are. The second criteria would be where you are going to live in France, because if you're applying for a long stay visitors visa, you're applying to be a resident. Therefore, you need to have somewhere to stay. This is where the whole question of rental versus owning, or even living at somebody's house for the first year. You can actually live with a family member or a friend if they can provide the documentation. So second criteria, where you are going to live and the evidence you can show for that. The third criteria I would say is the financial criteria. So how are you going to live in France for 1 year and not be a burden on the French society? So obviously the type of things they will ask to see is bank statements. So we're based on the UK bank statements. If you're coming from the UK, if you were coming from the USA, it would be USA bank statements. So it's from the country of origin. So bank statements for a minimum of 3 months, but also, if those bank statements aren't looking too healthy, then show your proof of revenue. That could be your retirement pension, it could be private pension, it could be your investment income, it could be savings. So there's lots of different criteria, lots of different ways of showing that. And then, of course, the last one would be healthcare. And it is an important point because, of course, for that first visa request, you have to prove that you're not a burden on the healthcare system. And the way to prove that would be either through private healthcare for the first year in France, or via our famous S1 document that retirees in receipt of state pension can request from the Department of Health and Pensions. And this substitutes the need to have a private healthcare plan. So there are the 4 key areas I would suggest that you need to be aware of when applying for a long stay visitors visa. And it's actually also the 4 key areas that anything to do with process in France is important.
Yeah, and we'll go into the S1 in a bit more detail in a moment. But so in terms of that application, do you have to apply can you apply in France, or do you apply in the UK? Where does the application take?
So the very first time you apply for a visitor's visa, you have to apply from country of origin. There is no way around that. The application itself is online, obviously, so you can be anywhere traveling, do your actual application, hence why we do them for our clients. We do them, they could be traveling all over the world, and we'll manage their applications for them and the appointment making for them. But once the appointment is in place, you have to go for your appointment in the UK or in country of origin. So yes, once you have the appointment, it is from the country of origin. And then once you move to France, you validate that visa online again, then the renewal is in France. So it's only the first application that is from country of origin. Okay.
Yeah. So I guess people can do that themselves, but my guess is there's a number of reasons why that may not always be the best way, particularly language and the pure bureaucracy and knowing what to say. Do people generally do it themselves, or would they generally be looking for somebody like yourself to support them?
Well, obviously, if I'm here today, it's generally speaking because people come to us to do it. And we have a reputation for helping people and having 100% success rate in visas. And I think anybody can do what they want to do, Nigel. As far as I'm concerned, everything we discussed today and in all of the webinars is out there in the world wide to find. It's information. The difference is if working with a specialist, we get the job done. And they don't need to understand all the nitty-gritty. They don't have to read through a plethora of information and wonder, is that the right information or not? Because when they come to specialists, then that's what we do. So I guess in my opinion, anybody can do what they want to do. But if the people come to us, it's because they just want to make sure the job gets done and they don't have to worry about anything, because let's face it, nobody likes to tick the wrong box. And when it's immigration, I think that fear factor of getting it wrong is higher than for other processes that you might go through. I think there is that, when you're investing in a property and paying hundreds and hundreds of thousands of euros, you think, well, you don't want to get your visa wrong.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing.
So you apply for your visa. Is residence then granted as part of that, or is that a separate process? What other bureaucracy do people have to go through as they move into the country?
Well, actually, it's interesting because I say there's 13 different paperwork processes. There are actually probably more that we deal with. But generally speaking, you do touch on about 13 different processes when you move in or live in another country. I'm speaking about France, but it could be other countries as well. So the visa is obviously one of the key parts of it, because people obviously want to get that right, but there are lots of others, and we can discuss those in a moment. But I would like to say that the actual visa itself, it's called a visa to come into a country. A visa is what you use, so the vocabulary is used correctly. A visa is what you use to come into a country. A residency card is what you get when you are living in that country. That is how it works. Visa to come in, residency card once you're living in France. The difference with a long stay visitor's visa in France, it's the only visa that stays a visa in your passport for the first year, which means once you've gone through the formalities, you don't need to go to your local prefecture to change it into a residency card. Unlike other visas, once you come in, it's valid for 3 months and then you have to go to your local prefecture to get your residency card. With a long stay visitor's visa, it stays in your passport for the first year and is automatically a residency card from the moment it's stamped by the immigration office. And it's only when you renew it that you actually get a residency card. Okay. So that's just to finish off on that visa part of it, make sure people understand the difference between a visa and a residency card. And yes, once you trigger your immigration and your visa card becomes a residency card, then of course the next process would, I imagine, be the most important for the listeners today, would be healthcare. You're in mute, Nigel.
That old mistake. Sorry about that. So can Brits retiring to France, can they access the state health system? Obviously, with or without an S1, for those particularly people who are pre-retirement, can they access the?
Yes, and like I said, I think the healthcare is probably the number 2 key priority for people moving to France of any age, because we have the younger generation coming across with families who it's very important for the children. But for the elderly generation, the retirees coming to France, be that early retirees or retirees, healthcare is very important. Now, the French healthcare system is an excellent system. It is a very good healthcare system, but it is not free. Okay, that is very important. It's very different to the UK system. And anybody who comes across to live in France can access the French healthcare system under different criteria. Okay, so at this particular moment, we're talking about retirees. So there are two options. One would be to apply as a retired person of retirement age receiving a state pension via the S1 form, which we touched on briefly earlier. If you have the S1 form sent to your home in France, you can use that S1 form to apply to the local healthcare service, which is the CPAM, to access healthcare system. So you would send off the S1 form with a various other list of documents as a retiree in France. And you would do that as soon as you come to France, once your visa has been validated. If you don't have an S1, and that's because you're younger than retirement age, or you're not in receipt of state pension, you can still access the French healthcare system. It just means you have to be living in France for 3 months and to be able to prove that. Okay, so when you come to France, say you came to France on the 1st of January, then you would start your file, but you wouldn't necessarily send it off for the first couple of months because, of course, you want to be living in France 3 months first, and you have to prove that. So proof of purchase of your property, utility bills, proving that you've moved to France, and they will ask for other details as well. So moving to France, accessing the French healthcare system as a retiree who does not have an S1, would be either via the PUMA system, which is the residency criteria itself, 3 months or more. Okay. And you could also be a retiree who has private pensions, as in receiving pensions, but not via the state. So you would still apply and give in proof of your retirement pensions as a retiree. So in answer to your question, a short answer is yes, you can all apply to the French healthcare system. The documents you would provide and what time you would apply is slightly different depending whether you have an S1 or you don't.
Right, yes, and so for the S1, you basically apply to the National Health Service International Department, or something, I think it is. It's National Health Service rather than there's a department there rather than the international pensions side, although when you go to the international pensions, it does link into the S1 system. So I personally who did it when I was in Spain, and it was a reasonably straightforward process.
Yeah, it's quite simple. Yeah, it's quite simple.
So that's helpful. The other thing to bear in mind is an EHIC and its new replacement, the GHIC. So for people who already have an EHIC, that is valid until you cease to, until it comes to an end. GHIC is its replacement following Brexit, and it's very similar. That, it's important to note, can be used when you're traveling, but it cannot be used as a resident. So you can't use it to get healthcare once you become resident in the EU. It should also bear in mind that it gives you access to, I don't think the term is urgent, it's required healthcare, so that it's something that has to be dealt with while you're traveling rather than something that could be dealt with when you get back. So it is not a substitute for travel insurance if you're traveling around the EU and so on. Is there anything you'd like to add on the EHIC or GHIC?
Just that for those who are secondary residents who are thinking of maybe applying for a 6-month visa to have a little bit more flexibility on the 9180, your EHIC/GHIC card is sufficient for healthcare to go through the visa process.
Right, okay. So one thing to bear in mind in terms of the visa, which I didn't mention, is that, there's a lot of sort of comment about the 90 and 180 days and that it's very restrictive and so on, and you've got the 6 months on there. The thing to bear in mind is that if you spend more than 183 days in France, you become tax resident anyway. So the restriction of sort of half time has always been there, assuming you don't want to become tax resident in France, and it's simply that now it's 90 and 180 rather than 180 and 360 or whatever, well, 365. So that is one of the things to bear in mind. Let's just cover driving. In terms of the taking your vehicle over there, one of the things to always bear in mind is that, drive on the other side of the road. The inconvenience of being on the wrong side of the vehicle when you go into car parks, when you pay a toll booth, when you go and think, should not be underestimated. So it may be, as it is to many people, almost a family member, but the car, if you go over in a British car, then you are going to have to face that constant inconvenience. But despite that, many people wish to take their car. So Tracy, how easy is it to import a car into France?
And again, it's a process to go through, and that is not necessarily as easy as it should be, especially since Brexit, because of course your car will have to go through customs. You will have to get what's called an A846 document via customs to be able to even register the car in France. That's your first step. Hence why I said earlier on in the webinar to make sure your transporter is aware you're bringing a car across, otherwise you won't get your A846 document. You need to bear in mind the cost of the importation of your car. I advise often with my clients against bringing the cars with them unless it has a sentimental value, because the cost of importing it via the ANTS website, there's going to be a cost for their famous categories, as they call it, the V5 in the UK, depending whether it's a diesel or a petrol car, depending on the size of the vehicle and its engine. So there is a cost of that, and a pollution tax for diesel cars. So that's something you want to estimate. Plus the process itself, you have to get this fiscal document from the tax office. You have to apply online via ANTS. You have to show a control technique, which is the equivalent of the MOT in the UK. It is not a straightforward process. So unless you have a car that you absolutely want to keep, because of the inconvenience as well of driving through the tolls, as Nigel says, why would you want to keep a UK car? I don't see the benefit of it. So think very closely on that one. We do have clients that bring them across and we do register them for them, but it has a cost and it is a bit hassly. So unless you are attached to your car emotionally, then get rid and buy a French car.
And is there
European car.
Is the VAT or duty payable when you import the car?
So unless you have an A846 document, you would pay 20% VAT plus 10% import duties on the value of your car.
Right, which is obviously restrictive as well. Let's move to the driving license. In terms of, can people continue to drive on their UK license, or do they have to get a French license?
So in agreement with the Brexit rules, you can continue to drive on your UK driving license when you come to France. If your driving license has expired or been exchanged, not exchanged, but renewed, I think would be the word, renewed after the end of the transition dates, then it's a good idea then to exchange it for a French one. If it was renewed before the end of the transition date, then it can continue on until expiry, or it's lost, or it's stolen, or you've committed a driving, I was going to say infraction, but is that a French word? And maybe I'm speaking franglais. But unless you've committed a driving offence, I think is the word, which would take points off your license, then you would have to exchange it automatically. So it's not a big worry, because if you do fall into the category of an exchange, you have the first year to do that from the moment you have your residency. So once you've got your visa, the date that gets stamped by the offer, you have a year to do that exchange. Okay. Yep. And that is a reasonably simple process online as well. So that's not the most complicated of process to go through, and it's not the first thing to do.
Right. Okay. So when Chrissy, comment here, with a driving license, you have to update when you change address. So does that mean you have to exchange? So I guess what it's saying is that if you're moving to France, then you should be changing the address to your on your driving license.
No, not necessarily. If you come into France with a UK driving license that is valid and wasn't renewed or expired after the end of the transition date, you can keep it with the address. Your UK driving with the UK address, you don't have to do anything with that. Some people, before they come across, change and renew, and then that puts them in the category of you have to exchange it in France. So no, just leave it, bring it across, and drive using a UK license.
Okay. So now, just quickly on banking, opening a bank account. How easy is it to open a bank account in France?
It's not the easiest of process, and you would think it would be, wouldn't you, Nigel? Really, in this day and age, you would think opening a bank account would be the most easiest thing to do. It's not always. Obviously, we help our clients with that, but the reason why it's not always the most easiest process is because having the proof of address is very important to open a banking account, and oftentimes you're in the middle of, leaving your UK address. You might have a complément de vente or not yet. So you need to have a proof of address to open a bank account in France. A complément de vente is proof of address, and most banks will accept that. Or a rental agreement, if you're taking a yearly rental agreement or 6-month rental agreement, they will accept that. But yeah, they do ask for sometimes your fiscal documents, proof of ID, proof of address to open a bank account. Online might be the best way to go to start with. So using one of the online banks like Brickline is quite popular at the moment for British people. So getting something set up. In the worst case scenario, if you can't get a residency bank account set up a non-residency bank account using your UK address, and then just change it once you've got your address in France. So that would be the way to go, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here. Do you have a link to the charges for each car exported, assuming you will have the A46?
Say that. Sorry, I didn't quite get that, Nigel. Sorry.
Do you have a link to the charges for each car exported, assuming you have the A846? I'm not certain I understand that.
Don't understand that one. I don't have a link to anything. That would be the customs. If you want to show exactly, if you want to know the cost for importing a car, it depends on the size, the engine, and the type of petrol. If you want a link to getting the A846, you have to reach out to the customs office at the border.
Okay. Just one sort of final question come here. What's the internet like in France? Is it good? Is the coverage universal, or is it variable?
I think it's pretty good, to be quite honest. And again, it's a subject that is variable to the area. So obviously fiber has gone pretty much everywhere, but when you're in a local village, on the top of a mountain somewhere, you may have problems. There are not a huge amount of service providers. There are 3 or 4 key service providers, but it's all much of a muchness. At the end of the day, it's all the main provider, of course. So I'd like to say that the coverage is pretty good, to be quite honest, universally. But you have kind of little pain points in some small rural areas. And my advice would be to you, if this is something that is important to you, if you're going to be, using your laptop a lot and things like that, then make sure when you're looking for your property, you test it whilst you're looking at the property. Stick on your 4G, see if it works, go on the Wi-Fi, ask the previous owners, knock on the neighbour's door and ask them what the Wi-Fi is like, what the fibre is like, ask the people around in the local area. Don't just count on the agents to tell you, because they may not be quite aware of how it is, or they might not tell you everything.
Yes, the answer will always be it's great.
Exactly. Yeah.
I certainly was told that in Spain when I moved to a rental there, and it turned out not to be.
Yeah.
There's a question here about an approximate cost to, as they say, handhold a move to France. if it may be best if that is dealt with, if you just want to email me and we'll pass that on and give an idea, because I think it will vary enormously according to which bits of it
Exactly, needs and requirements. We do bespoke service packages for people, relocation packages depending on the needs and requirements. So yeah, you can take that offline with Nigel, and Nigel will reach out to me.
Okay, so thank you. I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you to all for listening. Thank you, Tracy. I know some of you are planning to move in the near future. Others are planning well in advance. One is not planning to move till 2030, so they should be well ready by the time we get to that. As I've already said, I think we aim to be here to help you, and if we can help in any way, we will. So if you have any questions, please just send them to us. expats@expatnetwork.com. We've built up a really strong network of good quality service providers. So if there's anybody that you want to get assistance from in different areas, then again, just sort of contact us. And Tracy will obviously be able to help. And so if you just drop me a line, we can pass that on to you, on to her. If they want to contact you directly, Tracy, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, the best way would be to go onto my website where my contact details are. So it's lbsinfrance.com is the website address.
Right. Okay. And sorry, just one. Oh, well, just one last question. So, how friendly are the French in rural areas if you're the only foreigner?
Yeah, you're watching TV programs. I think the French people are extremely friendly in all of the areas. Quite frankly, I'm living in a small village, and I'm not the only English person now. I've been here for 30 years, but I find them extremely friendly. They say hello every morning. And how friendly they are depends on how much effort you put into your relationship in that village. So I don't think you can expect them to come and be friendly to you. I think you need to be going to be friendly to them and show them that you're absolutely thrilled to be living in their environment, and that what you give out comes back to you tenfold.
Right. Okay, on that positive note, we'll end. So again, thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and good luck with your move to France.